Dames en heren, hartelijk welkom bij de lezing van John Kinsella. Ik zal kort in het Nederlands John Kinsella introduceren. I also will introduce John Kinsella in English shortly, before he starts his reading. John Kinsella heeft een lange staat van dienst als dichter, redacteur, uitgever, docent. Schreef heel veel werk, meer dan 20 bundels. En zijn werk beweegt zich tussen een experimenteel en verhalend register. Dat kent u waarschijnlijk wel, ook van zijn werk. Maar vertrekt vrijwel altijd vanuit het landschap. Vanuit een plek waar de herinnering, maar ook het woede van het heden en de schade die daaruit voortkomt, zichtbaar wordt. We leven in onstuimige en ontwrichtende tijden. Tijden waarin het soms lijkt alsof onze samenleving er niet aan wil dat de samenleving aan zich onderhevig is aan zichzelf vernietigende krachten. Maar toch zijn er, en misschien zelfs in een groeiend aantal, nogal wat mensen die tegenwicht willen bieden aan degenen die de wereld, de natuur, het landschap, het leven van mensen willen exploiteren in plaats van ermee te leven. Ook kunstenaars, schrijvers en zeker dichters zijn zich bewust van de noodzaak van een tegenwicht, van verzet. Maar hoe geef je dat nou ruimte en vorm in de literatuur? Weten dat literatuur en poëzie in het bijzonder vindt zijn quintessence in een zorgvuldig gekoesterde ambiguïteit, in combinatie met het bieden van inhoud door middel van taal en als taal, in de vorm van taal. Hoe we een activistische houding en een activistische reikwijdte in de poëzie kunnen laten klinken, zonder in te leveren op de ambiguïteit die nodig is om de essentie van literatuur te behouden, hoort u vandaag van John Kinsella. John Kinsella has a long record of service as a poet and a teacher. He has written more than 20 collections, recently Firebreaks and Drowning in Weed selected poems. We at Poetry International, we are very pleased with having John Kinsella this festival edition as our guest. We are living in turbulent times in which our society seems disruptive in itself and prey to destructive forces many of us tend to ignore. But still there are, and maybe even in a growing amount, quite a lot of people who act as a counterforce against those who want to exploit the world, the nature, the landscape, the habitats, the lives of people, instead of living with them. Among those peoples, of course, we find artists, writers, poets, but a work of art like poetry finds its quintessence in precise rendering of ambiguity and in shaping content within language and as language. How to overcome this dilemma of taking an activist stand and keeping the ambiguity literature needs to stay literature. I think John Kinsella will help us today to set the path to find the answer. Ladies and gentlemen, John Kinsella.
Thank you for that generous, intelligent and empathetic introduction. I'm going to be fairly static reading this because you're going to have a translation up there and there's a kind of range that I can operate in. Normally I'm kind of all over the place, so I'm going to get my exercise out of the way first. It sounds funny, but the physicality of this is important to me. I walk 30 or 40 kilometres every day of my life. I go out into nature. Even in Rotterdam, I walk along the river. I try and find natural spaces, as natural as they can be, and engage with them. It's a very physical thing for me, a very visceral thing. So in giving this lecture tonight, this reading talk, I'd like you to bear in mind that it's not just static. It's not just there on the page and here's me telling you. It's a dialogue with you, and it's a dialogue with nature, and it's a dialogue with the world, and one I'm intensely, intensely passionate about. It is my life, and that if it has any worth my life, it is doing this. So, how does activist poetry cope with ambiguity? I'll say before I begin, and the words start flowing up there, the first poem I'm going to read in this, the bulldozer poem, was a poem used recently in some very intense activist activities, campaigns against the destruction of very rare bushland in Western Australia. And it became a kind of, part of that protest. And you can find lots of videos on the net being read in front of police and all the rest of it. And it became very empowering. Along with some of my fellow poets, James Quinton, Wendy Jenkins and other people, poetry became a very intense part of this protest. So bear that in mind, if you will, as I read the poems that come during this talk. How does activist poetry cope with ambiguity? This poem is more than likely unambiguous in its message, but is made up of many linguistic ambiguities and probably quite a few ambiguities of meaning. The bulldozer poem. Bulldozers rend flesh. Bulldozers make devils of good people. Bulldozers are compelled to do as they are told. Bulldozers grimace when they tear the earth's skin. From earth they came. Bulldozers are made by people who also want new mobile phones to play games on and to feed families. Bulldozers are observers of phenomena. Decisions are taken out of their hands. They are full of perceptions. They will hear our pleas and struggle against their masters. Bulldozers slice and dice. Bulldozers tenderise. Bulldozers reshape the sandpit, making grrring noises. Kids' motor skills. Bulldozers slice the snake in half so it chases its own tail, writing in front of its face. Bulldozers are vigorous percussionists, sounding the snap and boom of hollows caving in. Feathers of the cockatoos a whisper in the roar. Bulldozers deny the existence of ether. They know deep down in their pistons, deep in their levers, that all is spheres and heavens, and voices of ancestors worry at their peace. Bulldozers recognise final causes and embrace outcomes that put them out of work. There's always more scrub to delete. Surely. O continuous tractor, O, S and U blades, each to his order, his skill set, communal as D9 dozers whose buckets uplift to asteroids waiting to be quarried. O bulldozer, your history, O those halt tractors working the paddocks, O the first slow tanks crushing the battlefield, the interconnectedness of being. Philosopher, O you makers, Cummings and Caterpillar, O great cat we grew up in their thrall, whether we knew it or not, playing sports where the woodlands grew, where you rode in after the great trees had been removed. You innovate and flatten. We must know your worldliness, working with companies to make a world of endless horizons. It's a team effort, excoriating an ecosystem. Not even you can tackle an old growth tree alone. But we know your power, your pedigree, your sheer bloody-mindedness. Sorry, forgive us. We should keep this civil, O dozer. In you is a cosmology. We have yelled the names of bandicoots and possums, of kangaroos and echidnas, of honey-eaters and the day-sleeping tawny frogmouth. You kill in its silence. And now we stand before you, supplicant and yet resistant, asking you to hear us over your war cry, over your work ethic being played for all it's worth. Hear us, hear me. Don't laugh at our bathos, take us seriously. Forgive our inarticulateness, our scrabbling for words as you crush us, the world as we know it, the hand that fed you, that made you. Listen not to those officials who would have taken advantage of their position, who have turned their officers to hate the world and smile, kissing the tiny hands of babies that you can barely hear as your engines roar with power. But you don't see the exquisite colour of the world, bulldozer. Green is your irritant. We understand, bulldozer. We do. It is fear that compels you, ripping through eternity, embracing the inorganics of modernity. Ambiguity in the poem can be the generator of a desire to reconsider, to alter, to question. Activist poetry, specifically poetry that seeks to halt environmental damage, is about clearly delineated outcomes. And yet, if the poem doesn't enrich the reader in intellectual, spiritual, artistic and/or emotional ways, its impact is necessarily diluted or lost. It is not that the activist poem needs to be more than statement, but rather that in being poetry, it will necessarily be many things at once, many versions of itself, at least some of which will be beyond the poet's understanding. Language itself generates meanings, and its meanings change over time. Sound, visual references, shape and words themselves will bring different meanings to different people at different times in different places. And this is good and necessary. And in recognising this, activist poets are acknowledging the intimacy with which they are connected to what it is they are trying to protect, to save. Even if we feel that nature should exist outside the human, we still need to understand how we do or don't connect with this. Ambiguity in a poem generates ways of considering this without setting rules. Can a figurative poem be directly activist? Or does a poem need to be more rather than less polemical, to show its integrity regarding change? Can we create an activist poem that has characteristics of metaphor and polemic and fuse them into something dynamic, ambiguous, indirect, yet still intense and capable of encouraging people to consider a situation? Not to tell people what to do, but to encourage them to investigate an issue in diverse ways, to find that language compels us towards liberation and a just position regarding the natural world and our relationship to it. The self as a mirror to the biosphere. Maybe we can write a rhetorical lyric. We can say, we can rant, but let the poem open those proverbial doors of perception, of which we are not even aware when we write. The awareness comes later. Interestingly, the poet Louis MacNeice, whose politics and ethics were very, 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 very different from my own, which is fine, wrote in his note to Autumn Journal, published by Faber and Faber in 1939 in London, he said, "If I had been writing a didactic poem proper, it would have been my job to qualify or eliminate these overstatements and inconsistencies." First, the idea of writing a purely didactic poem seems odd to me personally, though I can be didactic. But a poem, through the act of being a poem, undermines its own certainties, and the constraint that form, open or closed, imposes on the reading necessarily bends as much as directs what is being said. It's just not that conclusive, surely. My purpose is not to define versions of ambiguity, and we think of Empson's 7 types, or for example, to cite the New Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, and this is a quote, "Beardsley, Courage and Rimond make a case for restricting the term ambiguity to utterances whose multiple interpretations are mutually exclusive and thus lead to indecisiveness of meaning." Close quote. Rather, I wish to acknowledge ambiguity's essential nature in the poem. In writing an activist poem, we need knowledge of polysemy, or polysemy, however you want to pronounce it, and of ambiguity. This being, to quote Empson, any verbal nuance, however slight, which gives room for alternative reactions to the same piece of language. End of quote. It is essential to know that whatever we declare as a wrong or right is actually open to reinterpretation and misinterpretation. We need to move beyond rhetoric, beyond linguistics and critical discourse, and go to the essence of crisis and work with language under that pressure. This misreading of a text should be the guide, the generator, rather than the specifics of what we want to convey. A poem is ineffective as an activist moment if we have not understood that meaning is never stable. However, this is not a model, and there is no such thing as an activist poem per se. A poem responding to, for example, an ecological crisis can never be generic, as though each crisis is part of a greater ecological crisis. Its coordinates and variables are specific, if interlinked. So we are creating sequences of interconnected poems that are nonetheless case-specific, or maybe undoing cases. But are we really talking about variations of didactic poetry? Are we creating an opposition, or maybe a compatible contrary to ambiguous poetry? Of course not. Didactic poetry, like all poetry, can be ambiguous. When I talk of an activist poem, I'm talking about something that will inevitably be ambiguous in varying degrees, but to a lesser or greater degree, didactic. Yet even with didactic poetry, a poetry of teaching and learning, what constitutes such qualities is elusive. Back to the Princeton Encyclopedia, and this is a quote. "Aware of such proliferating contexts, we try to focus here chiefly, but not exclusively, on poetry which clearly intends, useful teaching, embodying Horace's instruction and delight in the genre of didactic poems." End of quote. Well, if I'm being didactic in my activist poems, I'm doing so to inform as extension of witness. And I do hope to bring positive change, but I'm certainly not interested in delight, unless it be delight in the agency and intactness of the natural world. Late in the Princeton entry, we read, quote, "In some, modern didacticism assumed protean forms that could no longer be forced into the genre classifications of the Augustans." End of quote. And this would accord with the contemporary possibilities for activist poems that are necessarily ambiguous. The condition of our presence on the earth is no more ambiguous than that of any other life form. But our relationship with the earth has become increasingly ambiguous. The very act of typing this, of speaking this in a modern performance space, is creating a relationship with the life of the planet itself, a relationship that is at its best ambiguous and at worst hypocritical. Poems of activism have to be informed by this knowledge, and if not in the writing as we'd hope, certainly in the experiencing. Activist poems augment and maybe extend direct action, but they rarely operate alone. They perform best in atmospheres of protest, of refusal to comply with the damage being done. My opinions, attitudes, ethics and politics are not remotely ambiguous. I'm a vegan, anarchist, pacifist, and I believe in a non-violent and gradual evolution of the state into smaller communal fragments of consensus and dialogue. I call this international regionalism. It is not isolationist, but it is respectful of difference, geography, culturality, and the mutuality of autonomy. On the other hand, though my poems can often be very direct accusations and certainly witnessings, with direct opinion coming through loud and clear, overall I'd say I write an ambiguous poetry. The act of poetry itself doesn't necessarily have to introduce ambiguity, as much traditional ritualistic song seems to show. But wherever there is a figurative language, there is slippage. And even the fixed points of a song alter over time in the ongoing process of reinterpretation. It is too easy to become anthropological in reading poem as ritual, especially within traditional contexts, which is to colonise symbol and metaphor to reinvent similes. Poetry, by and large, contains at least aspects of ambiguity because it is repeated, whether through mnemonics and memory or the passing down of written inscribed texts. Ambiguity increases as time passes, and the originating moment of the poem, song or text is lost. Ambiguity is more threatening to state corporate military control than even didacticism. If the power structures can't comprehend something, they either ignore it or destroy it. A lot of poetry of protest survives because it simply isn't understood, which doesn't mean it is ineffective. Often it means it's highly effective. Meaning is fluid if the form of the poem is relatively stable. And the form suggests a kind of conservatism, an inherited, recognisable model that operates as an acceptable template. Even the word poem is a kind of state permission to perform a literary act. We all know that poetry is at the core of not only many religious texts, but also official expressions of state. Here I mean those poems written for coronations, inaugurations, military victories, celebrations of a new building. On the other hand, poems are also written to express anti-war, republican, anti-state, and other oppositions to the status quo. The poem can contain the radical and the conservative, and it's this ambiguity in form, in genre, in process and identification that makes poetry such a valuable model of radical expression. In 2015, the state government of New South Wales in Australia published a booklet on schools on how to identify and suppress radicalism in students. Supposedly a response to the radicalisation of Australian youth by operatives of the Islamic State and other violent fundamentalist Islamic groups, the government used the crisis of violence to seek to control other forms of oppositional behaviour by defining them as violent threats to ordinary Australian citizens. One case study used in this booklet for schools involved a hypothetical student who became a forest camp anti-logging protester. We follow the narrative of her radicalisation through assault charges in resisting police and loggers, through to her seeing the light and joining a moderate official ecological group. This narrative is more than an appalling propaganda exercise. It is an overt usage of the state-run education system to control an individual's relationship to the state. Ecological protests are very rarely cases of attack, but almost always cases of defence. Loggers and the police most often attack the protesters trying to save ancient woodland from being destroyed by the state and its capitalist overlords. An act of sabotage against logging machinery is very different from police charging down protesters with horses and batons. I know, because I have seen these things firsthand. To align acts of public terror with acts of ecological protection is not only to confuse the issues, but to exploit violent acts of terrorism in order to control other aspects of social and political freedom. To my mind, poetry must wrest control of language back from these oppressors and propagandists and undo the state and business control of learning. Poetry is a means of teaching freedom of thought and expression, as well as a vehicle for free expression. Ambiguity allows us to write in invisible ink on one hand, beyond detection, yet also to speak loudly and boldly at once. This is not a paradox. It is the very nature of poetry itself and always has been. So who is speaking? Who is the state to blame for the voice of the poem, for what it does and doesn't say, for what it enacts and incites? What of the ambiguity of the self, ambiguity of the unified self, ambiguity of personal pronouns, ambiguity of responsibility, ambiguity of audience, ambiguity of identity and identification? In writing activist poems, in trying to prevent the destruction of habitat, there is a need to be very conscious of the poem's voice. How much of ourselves is in there? Why does it matter? Well, primarily it's a question of integrity and a willingness to be held accountable for what you are saying. But there's also a question of authenticity and reliability. Is the poem's voice to be trusted? Can the poem that talks of the destruction of forest be effective if it's full of wrong data? If the details don't match the situation? Isn't this ambiguity? Isn't this figurative? Can we, for example, say in the poem something about a type of bird or animal that isn't actually present in the forest that we are trying to protect? Is the talismanic protective nature of the poem impaired by what seems misinformation? An experienced teacher of poetry might reply, well, it's a poem, not a scientific report, and what does it matter? What is at stake in the poem are a mood, a suggestion, a conceit, and a deeper point of affect. That's all true, and I think data isn't vital to making a poem create a mood. After all, we can read a Shelley poem to an Australian forest protest and it can have a powerful effect on an audience, can inspire them to further action through a correlative of affect and mood. But it won't have the same effect as a poem written by, say, an Aboriginal Australian poet who has profound knowledge of the environment out of which he or she is writing. Why is this? Because inherent and specific knowledges of a place extend that place into the audience's psyches. A sharing of presence takes place. I always try to include correct and informed data in my activist poems, though that data often creates images and impressions that move far away from the science of locale or situation. There are many levels of awareness occurring in any poem, and I like my poems to allow these breadths of expression. Poems are complex sights, especially when they seem to be at their most obvious. And this complexity allows us to perform many roles of self and non-self in the space of a poem. The activist poem is always going to be about the place, the subject one is trying to protect or advocate for, but sometimes I is too potent a force to exhibit in the poem, and the move away from the lyrical I is far more effective. How close or how distant the self is in a poem can change the poem's reception and potency in all sorts of ways. In writing poems of protection and protest in recent environmental actions, I have made use of the ambiguous and evasive figure of Sweeney. Sweeney, the mythological Irish figure. I'm going to read a Sweeney poem. Sweeney the barn owl opens his eyes wide in broad daylight. Sweeney looks down at the people coming out of the hospital. They have seen him. He knows it in his bones. Yes, now their eyes search his eyes, and the shock of light reaches as far inside as the flames that drove him out of the tall tree on the hillside. Where can I rest? He asked them. The main roads are cutting down all the old growth wandoos and salmon gums and York gums, slicing through their anniversaries with a righteousness that will truck no argument. These living heritage buildings will conduct our lives in and around our places of eating and worship. Sweeney shuts his eyes on them, high up in the gum that clings to the edge of the car park. Tonight, he will fly southeast, aiming to reach the great trees still remaining on the York-Querreting Road before they are brought down, before red-tailed phascogales and Carnaby black cockatoo and rainbow bee-eater are forced to find somewhere else to feed and nest and hide from owl, or vanish. And in the matutinal revelation that abbreviates his waking hours, upside down in a tree killer's world, Sweeney will hoot at their stupidity, a klaxon call just before the crash that will wipe us all out. On the other hand, where something has directly affected the well-being of my own son, for example, also protesting, I am personal and direct, a parent speaking to parents, to children, as we all are. And this poem is a direct address to and it was sent to him, the leader of Western Australia of the time. He's now been pushed out of power because of all this, because of what he did, the damage he did. So this poem, this is a very direct one, accounts to the Premier of Western Australia. I hold you accountable for the trauma our 13-year-old is going through as habitat for the birds he loves is destroyed. I hold you accountable for the emphysema of the biosphere, the gasp you add to our last gasps, deoxygenated, stranded by the road. I hold you accountable for the zoo of death, for the ark scuttled and going down with all hands on board, for survivors shot on the surface. I hold you accountable for helping boil the planet in its own oil, for encasing it in bitumen dredged from the pits of hell. I hold you accountable for making science a convenience store in which well-fed bullies stuff their baskets without paying. I hold you accountable for cruelty and torture, for casualties you don't acknowledge, for ignoring alternatives to feed your vanity. I hold you accountable for treating life as a game in which winner takes all, a psychology of children instilled by abusive adults. This is what I'm yelling at policemen. Passively, I'm never physically violent, but I'm yelling this, and I mean it. And extending responses to an imposing and malign state, I take a late 19th century poem, so I'm going to look at a historical poem by the so-called Goldfields poet, late 19th century, Willy Willy the Boulder Bard, which ironises both the ode's form and the place very away from the ode's origins and conventions, and reconfigures the ode as a critique of the state in its impact on the local, and as a broader generic entity of oppression, control and absurdity. So, starting with the late 19th century, this is late 19th century colonial Western Australia. So starting with the late 19th century piece of ironic versifying, that is a declaration of both extremity and difference, but also of a weird camaraderie of connection in this isolation, Of course, there is irony in its being an expression of an alienation of stolen Indigenous land, which for the local people had been anything but a hell. So what I'm about to read is a poem written in the late 19th century about Western Australia and all its wrongs. It's an irony, of course, because it's the West Australian colonial state, not the Indigenous place that's being discussed, but nonetheless. Ode to Westralia. Land of forests, fleas and flies, blighted hopes and blighted eyes, art thou hell in earth's disguise, Westralia? Art thou some volcanic blast by volcano spurned outcast? Art unfinished made the last Westralia? Wert thou once the chosen land where Adam broke God's one command, that he in wrath changed thee to sand, Westralia? Land of politicians silly, home of wind and willy-willy, land of blanket, tent and billy, Westralia. Home of brokers, bummers, clerks, nest of sharpers, mining sharks, dried up lakes and desert parks, Westralia. Lands of humpies, brothels, inns, old bag huts and empty tins, land of blackest grievous sins, Westralia. My response, and I wrote a response to this poem, which is where I'm going with this, my response comes in the context of oppression, dispossession of Indigenous people, environmental destruction, and some people's desire to deny the truths of these issues. The question to ask, maybe, is whether or not it's more or less ambiguous than the original, the one I just read. In itself, a somewhat faint and distant simulacrum and parody of the Pindarian Ode. The politics and ethics at work are obviously different and have difference, but it's worth wondering where ambiguity and didacticism fade in and out of perspective. Does humour in the first poem enhance or intensify ambiguity? Do my version's brutal confrontations with what I consider a sad reality manifest ambiguities in its exponential metatext, the form of the ode itself, the Ode of Westralia, Plato, the trajectories of rhetoric and Latin poetry, popular culture, popular cultural references, environmentalism, Victoriana, contemporary political discourse? Both poems are metatextual poems, of course, but the first is speaking with those in the know, those in the goldfields who share the experience of the outback. Mine is a direct confrontation with authority, but both are anti-authoritarian. Now here's mine. So mine is a reaction to that first 19th century poem about Western Australia and what the government was. They're both anti-authoritarian, but they're very different. So, mine's called A New Ode to Westralia, Anthem for All Future Sporting Events. And maybe I should explain, Western Australians and Australians are obsessed with sports. Just obsessed. A forest could fall and they wouldn't notice because they're watching the football. Now, that's fine to watch the football, but you should notice the forest falling. Anyway, A New Ode to Westralia, Anthem for All Future Sporting Events. The state is killing our souls. The state has murdered the people. Some they murder over and over. The state has deployed vicious antibodies to kill the good cells and let the infection thrive. The state has equated work with destruction and manipulated the outcome. Remember, the state has no love for unions. The state deployed its shock troops who watched on as poems were yelled at them, their commander marshalling attitudes saying, "How can we shut this one up?" Poets of the world take notice. They will close you down the moment you break free of your anthologies, your safety in pages of literary journals, the comforts of award nights. The state shapes itself out of the dust rising from under forest, which is its soul exposed to a caustic, toxic atmosphere made by so many other such actions of malice. The shape is cartoonish to start with, then like a Hollywood effect, then just terrifying ectoplasm feeding on sap and blood and grit. The state chips and mulches because it has heard rumours of Plato's theory of forms and thinks it needs a new translation full of local business inflection, full of their own brand of civilisation. The state has no intention of letting traditional owners maintain traditional places of worship, of culture, of belonging. It's always been about the twin poles of denial and deletion. The state has reservoirs of species names and the odd pressed sample of a flower they wish only to remain as a Latin name and a collectible, gathering in worth, which is the essence of market economics, rolling on through the bushland with gung-ho, in-your-face finality. The state wants you to gasp as the tall trees crack and are brought down fast, the pair of tawny frogmouths lifting to nowhere, dazzled by daylight. And finally, the seemingly unambiguous address to a chainsaw, extension of the state. It takes us back to the bulldozer poem with which I began, in which modernity's complex and shifting array of ambiguities is operating at full tilt to create a desire for liberation for the natural over the machine choice. In the bulldozer poem, the first poem I read, modernity is associated with inorganics and destruction. A bulldozer will become redundant if the destruction is halted. It is, in the poem I wrote, it is fear that compels you, rippling through eternity, embracing the inorganics of modernity. And in the same way, the chainsaw poem I'm about to read does the same, but differently. Modernity represented as loss, not gain for the planet, and ultimately for humanity. The chainsaw poem was written back in the early 2000s, so the bulldozer poem echoes that poem, the personified object ironising the human failure to empathise with other living things. In Chainsaw, the machine becomes an extension of the human, almost organic. This irony is at play in both poems. Chainsaw. The seared flesh of wood cut to a polish deceives. The rip and tear of the chain, its rapid cycling, a covering up of raw savagery. It is not just machine. In the blur of its action, in its guttural roar, it hides the malice of organics. Cybernetic, empirical, absolutist, the separation of church and state, conspiracies against the environmental lobby, enforcement of fear are at the core of its modus operandi. The cut of softwood is deceptive, hardwood dramatic. Just before dark on the chill evening, the sparks rain out, dirty wood hollowed by termites. Their digested sand deposits, capillary highways imploded. The chainsaw effect. It is not subtle, it is not ambient, it is nothing. A clogged air filter has it sucking up more juice, it gargles, floods, chokes into silence. Sawdust dresses, boots, jeans the field. Gradually, the paddock is cleared. The wood stacked in cords along the lounge room wall. A darkness kicks back and the cutout bar jerks into place and the distant chainsaw dissipates. Further on, some seconds later, another does the same. They follow the onset of darkness, a relay of severing, a ragged harmonic stretching back to its beginnings, gung-ho, blazon, overconfident, hubristic to the final cut. Last drop of fuel. In the face of global habitat destruction, it would seem the time for radical solutions to the problem. But radical solutions and pragmatic outcomes that are non-violent and that damage nothing in their implementation are difficult to achieve. The work of a radical feminist such as Shulamith Firestone's, and I'm sure people reel back when she's very controversial now. The work of radical feminists such as Shulamith Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex, published by the incredible Women's Press in 1979, might identify a problem in the biology of reproduction limiting women's freedom and ensuring the damaging infrastructure of patriarchy, but her solution of cybernetic laboratory reproduction and gestation is a destructive process in terms of technology's impact on the planet, aside from being a denial of free will. Firestone says, to quote, "The division of labour will be ended by the elimination of labour altogether through cybernetics. The tyranny of the biological family would be broken." Now, this may be true, but the tyranny of further environmental exploitation to facilitate such cybernetics, even they could be considered an answer to this inequality and oppression, which I don't deny exists, would be the result. The scale of biological machinery required would come at a cost to the biosphere. So there would be a liberation, but it would also damage, and that's no liberation at all. So, solutions to radical problems require radically non-invasive answers. It should be noted that rising out of her time, the late 1960s, a radical correction seemed an answer. Those males giving up ownership of the family, from Engels, and sharing the role of child rearing have at least made a step in the right direction. In this context, Let us consider the activist power of Anne Sexton's poem Unknown Girl in the Maternity Ward, and its lines regarding the responsibility of life itself falling entirely on the young woman who has just given birth in the absence of the baby's father, and the social pressures on that circumstance. And that was first published from Bedlam and partway back in 1960. And the lines go, "Down the hall, the baskets start back. My arms fit you like a sleeve. They hold catkins of your willows, the wild bee farms of your nerves, each muscle and fold of your first days. Your old man's face disarms the nurses, but the doctors return to scold me. I speak. It is you my silence harms. I should have known. I should have told them something to write down. My voice alarms my throat. Name a father? None. I hold you and name you bastard in my arms." Now, without change in societal attitudes and without a shift away from patriarchal oppressions, this poem can't truly work as an activist tool, whatever the poet's intentions. But in conjunction with on-the-ground activisms, it can. The poem's ambiguities open pathways to numerous overlapping intercultural and cross-gendering conversations. We can read the poem many ways, and those many ways are an advantage when combined with direct action. Very often presenting the condition of a wrong is adequate to prompt a movement towards change, especially when operating on a collective, communal level. Radical notions don't necessarily provide radical solutions to problems. If more damage is done, then that's no answer. The Marxist who correctly identifies labour as a source of inequality does not solve the problem by technologising at the cost of the planet, shutting the biosphere down to bring a temporary equality. Equality and fairness come through ecological consciousness and respecting natural environments. We need them, and our integrity absolutely requires such justice. In the activist moment, in the poetry of dialogue with place and environment, we might, as poets, be part of this, with minimal damage as a consequence. So I finished there, but I'm going to add a note because Firestone noted something that Engels said, which I think is interesting. What's so strange is, obviously making machines to make babies, apart from whatever it is, could only lead to a damaging technology. But the point she's making is a good one, and that is that people need to respect women beyond being biological machines. Fair enough. As a feminist myself, I deeply believe in the tenets of feminism. Seems reasonable to me. It's just that practically it will cost the planet. There needs to be other ways. But Firestone noted this. She said, Engels did observe that the original division of labour was between man and woman for the purpose of childbreeding, that within the family the husband was the owner, the wife the means of production, the children the labour, and that reproduction of the human species was an important economic system distinct from the means of production. So in identifying the tyranny of the family machine, I think she was accurate. What she misses, of course, is the family machine can also be very liberating and encouraging as well. But sometimes when radical activist things have to be said, you get those strange out of balance kind of things that pragmatically don't work and they're not real. Most people who are in families, as I am myself, think, well, that's just not true. That's not how my family works. But if we think about it realistically, families still within the state and within the patriarchy, they do have that tendency. So it's like with any activism. All I'm saying is that, poetry is a wonderful means, because of the ambiguity, of dealing with some of these complexities without always having the absolute answer. But it's a part of a process towards moving towards an answer. And I have seen poems stop bulldozers. I have seen poems stop, ended up in me being arrested, but it stopped a kind of process of loading nuclear ships in Western Australia back in the early 80s. I have used poems against people being beaten in custody. I've used poems in many different forms as activist interventions. They may not be the answer, but they're certainly part of the activist process. And the ambiguity is not a negative, it's a positive. Thank you, you've been patient.
Dankjewel. Thank you very much, John, for your inspiring reading. And luckily we have probably possibilities to publish it and even the translation, so everybody here tonight can read it and reread it, because it's full of interesting perspectives. Thank you. Thank you, audience, for your concentration. We have a slight pause of half an hour, and then we're about to hear the Japanese poet Gozo Yoshimashu with 3 musicians working on a combination of sound, text, movement, bodily activities, which I think will be a very inspiring and beautiful program. You can also go to 3 poets in the other studio downstairs, but hopefully you'll be here this night, either here or there, to be with Poetry International. Thank you very much.